Cool. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to MuHi's online public interview series. For those of you who have joined us for the first time, thanks so much for tuning in. I think we can all agree that the world in which we live in has changed dramatically over the past few months. And in such circumstances, we see new questions and new challenges arising every day. So to respond to such times, we turn to the experts. This interview series will bring in a number of different academics from various disciplines, and we have a conversation about their unique perspective on the times we face. For today's interview, we're joined by Professor Jodie McVernon. Thank you so much for giving us your time today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So let's just start off by, could you give us a bit of an introduction about what you do?
Sure. So I'm a public health physician and I'm the Director of Epidemiology at the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity. And I lead, among other things, a nationally distributed group of modelers that works to use infectious disease models to help inform policy decision-making in Australia and the region.
Great. So I think we're a few months into this whole situation. So I think it's an interesting point at which we can start to reflect on some of the things that we've done so far. So how has Australia performed in comparison to the models that we've created before the lockdown?
So I think the uses of modelling need to then be understood. So I think how's Australia performed in its pandemic response? I think most of us who live here are pretty grateful that we're living here right now and not experiencing the kind of intensity of pandemics and events that have been seen in many parts of the world. Modelling was one of the information sources that was used to guide early decision making in Australia, and like many other countries, we have used models and advised policymakers based on the early epidemic experience from Wuhan and then other epidemics around the world to project what might happen here had the infection been imported and established and taken off in the same way. So those early scenarios allowed policy decision makers to think about what the likely clinical and health impacts might be, and with that then to think about the range of measures that needed to be put in place to protect Australia. So with that, there needed to be clearly an expansion of our public health capacity to be able to identify and isolate cases and quarantine contacts. There was corresponding time for preparedness in the health systems capacity. Early on, we had border measures which were very influential at delaying early establishment of spread. And at the same time, recognising how infectious this disease is, with other countries realised that we would also need to implement stringent social measures just to reduce the risk of infection spread across the community. So those three things together have been core elements in protecting Australia.
Yeah, absolutely. So now, would you say that in response, so we've made a lot of decisions based on the models that you guys have created. But is now a good time to start easing restrictions?
So the models that we used in preparedness were scenarios, and now in thinking about how Australia is going during the response, different models are being used based on the local data to estimate how the epidemic is spreading. So we use something called R-effective, which our Prime Minister now can roll off his tongue, to look at the rate at which individuals who are infected are making secondary infections. And if that number is at or below 1, the epidemic won't grow. And in Australia, we currently have very low case numbers. We have a very low R-effective number that's less than 1. We're not seeing widespread community transmission. But what we are seeing and what we anticipate we'll still see are localised outbreaks. And that's where that public health response capacity is critical to identify those spot fires, isolate cases, trace their contacts, quarantine them appropriately, and make sure then that those infections don't start spreading through the community. So we expect to see these little bursts, but we're not seeing wider community transmission. So those are our sort of immediate goals. And having recently eased restrictions, we now need to see, it will take a couple of weeks to see what's happening there, that those parameters remain good measures to show that disease transmission is still low.
Yep. Overall, you'd say that in general, we've done a pretty good job in response to these models?
Well, as I say, I think our case numbers are a testament to that, and we've certainly not had anything like the clinical burden. Obviously, every case is important, but the majority of our infections remain having been imported from other countries and from cruise ships.
Great. So I'd now like to talk a little bit about the creation of these models themselves. So we've seen a couple of pandemics in the past few decades. So I was just wondering, how has the modeling for COVID differed from other pandemics in the past, like SARS, for example?
Yeah. So every pathogen is a little bit different, and most of the pandemic preparedness planning that's been done has been for influenza. And we did have a pandemic of influenza in 2009 that fortunately was incredibly mild. The groups that I'm associated with have been working closely with the Australian government over the last 10 years to develop these influenza preparedness models. I think the big difference between flu and COVID is just how long and slow and drawn out this epidemic is and will continue to be over time. And obviously its severity is well beyond anything that we've experienced in recent times. And that's necessitated this whole suite of public health measures that really were not written into any pandemic preparedness plans. So SARS and MERS were serious pathogens, but not so readily spread. And countries that had experience of SARS and MERS had very well developed public health systems for that contact tracing and testing and things that have been pivotal to this coronavirus response. But the extent of spread, the duration of spread, the severity of disease, all put this well beyond our experience of pandemics over a long time frame.
Yeah, excellent. So in response to the pandemic, and as we know, like the government policy is influenced by the modeling that you guys have done. Has the government policy been solely based around COVID modeling, or does it also take into account possible negative health impacts of a lockdown? So is there a possibility that the lockdown, people are more likely to suffer from other health conditions?
Yeah, so I think again, there are kind of two phases that we need to think about this response. Early on in that very initial phase, the key target was to avert a public health emergency. We did not want to be using ice rinks as morgues or having refrigerated trucks outside hospitals. So all of the focus early on was about understanding as much as we could about this infection and preventing that first wave. And the lockdown measures that came as part of that clearly have had other health and social impacts. And one of the biggest concerns from a health perspective is that fear of COVID itself has prevented people from attending their medical practitioners for their usual medical problems. So there's been a reduction in presentations in Australia to people, to their primary care physicians and to hospitals. And across the world, there are much greater concerns about the long-term impacts on disease control programs and immunisation programs that could really undo years of investment in health systems, particularly in low and middle income countries. But now is the phase, having averted that first crisis, we're on the life raft, and that was the sort of terminology a couple of months ago. Now that was the time, having developed an initial economic rescue package, to then look in a much more nuanced way at all of the health and societal and economic impacts of this disease and its response, and to work out the ways to maintain the public safety while trying to return to some degree of economic growth and normalcy and societal freedoms. So all of those things have to be balanced much more in the sort of calmer light of day, having gained control of the situation. So they were always important, but not all of them could be considered in the heat of the moment in that initial response.
Yeah. So you mentioned like we're in a stage where we're attempting to return to normalcy. I'm sorry if I'm opening like Pandora's box or something like that, but I wanted to talk a little bit about schools. So schools have been a bit of a hot topic across the board. I was wondering if I could get your opinion on that.
So the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee has always said that schools are safe. And the thing about this infectious disease, it is testing us in so many ways. It is teaching us different things in so many ways. Unlike every other infectious disease, pretty much, and originally was a paediatrician and I'm a parent, we're so used to thinking of children as the super spreaders of disease and the agents of, mass destruction on the biological front. But children do not seem to be very susceptible to this infection. And when they get it, they very rarely have symptoms, and they don't seem to be good at spreading infection. So obviously this has been keenly watched around the world. The 2009 flu pandemic started with outbreaks in schools and sleepover parties and birthday parties. This pandemic started with adult gatherings. So we've seen massive outbreaks. We've seen disastrous outbreaks on cruise ships, but largely associated with adult gatherings in large numbers. And there's an increasing interest in the role of mass gatherings per se in spreading this disease. In Australia, there were 15 instances of COVID introduction into schools that were actively investigated. Usually an adult was the introducer, I will say. And in those 15 schools, there were only 2 secondary transmission events identified. And this was going around swabbing all the close contacts in the schools. And in one school, a whole class was had antibody testing. Several weeks later, and none of them seroconverted. So children just don't seem to be good at spreading this disease. And that means if we want to return society to normal, education is essential. So, you know, education is important for our children if they're going to have a future. If they're not particularly at risk of getting this disease or spreading it, they're kind of the most logical people to send back to mix with each other. Where there have been transmissions in schools, it's usually adult to adult. So we need to be sure that teachers, while undertaking their important role, protect themselves from each other. And we need to keep the dirty parents away. So drop your kids off and leave them, let the kids mix. But it's really about avoiding those adult to adult mixing events that we believe are higher risk.
Yep. Would it be different if we looked at high schools, upper high schools, like a year 12?
Well, so, and there are trade-offs here. So, you know, you think about social distancing being an important practice, and actually the current guidelines that the Australian Health Protection Principle Committee has released says that we understand social distancing can't be enforced at the 4 metre square rule in classrooms. But there's a trade-off between the importance of education and also the ability of individuals to regulate themselves. So clearly year 11 and 12 are critical years. They're the first year level to have returned back in Victoria because of the importance of their educational stage. And they're old enough to be able to regulate their own behaviour and not run around hugging each other and, you know, rolling around in the playground. So, you know, all of those things need to be taken into account when thinking about the risk-benefit profile. And while those individuals may be a little more likely than younger children to catch and spread infection, they're also more able to manage themselves.
Yep. So to finish off this section, I'd just like to ask, where do you think Australia is heading now, and will we have a second wave?
So look, I think Australia's in an interesting position. Clearly, we're looking to loosen, you know, our restraints, and we are progressing into this new normal where, you know, hygiene and increased hygiene and, you know, remote handshakes and all these other things are going to be with us for a very long time. We think this virus is going to be with us for a very long time. So life as normal as we knew it, with frequent travel and all those sorts of things, I think are distant. Where we're headed now really depends on how the society, how the community can sustain the incredible effort that it's made to reduce the spread of this disease. And we are putting many mitigation methods in place. There are all kinds of restrictions in place, but really it's up to the public to continue their commitment to protecting each other from this virus. So Australia is keen to have a graded response to the new normal. You know, clearly it would be a disaster to get small businesses to reopen and buy in stock and then have to be locked down and closed. That would be really, really disastrous for them and very disruptive to the community. And you know, we're trying to get the public to work out how to move with more confidence. We don't have the fear that other countries have had. So, you know, we're on a bit of a balancing edge of whether we will take this seriously enough and can sustain this into the longer term. But I'm confident that the public has done such a magnificent job that they'll be able to continue that into the future.
Awesome, yeah. So now let's switch gears a little bit, and I'd like to talk a bit about vaccines. Mm-hmm. So how far away do you think the vaccine is? What stage is Australia at?
How long's a piece of string? So I think I've said before, if you know, if a vaccine for COVID were down to effort, we'd probably have it in 6 weeks, but that's not realistic. The reality is we haven't had a successful coronavirus vaccine before. You know, thanks to global efforts, the world is well placed to have had a whole lot of platform technologies in development and funding mechanisms to be released to help support the development of multiple vaccine candidates at the same time. And we're seeing some of those vaccines going into humans already. Personally, I don't have amazing confidence about some of the early animal findings of some of those trials, but clearly this is such an important vaccine that the race to a vaccine is very intense. But even once a suitable candidate can be identified, it needs to be shown to make antibodies, it needs to be shown to be safe in sufficient numbers of people. And then we need to work out what the manufacturing capacity is to be able to make a vaccine that is going to be highly desirable because of the high death rate of this disease. But also this is a vaccine that's going to have massive economic importance. If we think about the implications for being able to open up societies and trade and travel and other things, this will be, you know, efficacious vaccines will be very highly sought after. So I think we're in a very interesting time in seeing what candidates come forward, how successful they are in trials, but then, you know, whether there'll be the global manufacturing capacity to get large numbers of vaccines out, if they are available, how those will be distributed, how those will be equitably shared. and what the processes will be. So I think we started off saying it would be at least 12 to 18 months, and then people got in their heads, oh, it'll be 12 to 18 months when we get a vaccine. It may be never, it may be a couple of years, but it will be challenging, and we'll have very hard decisions to make about how to give that vaccine.
And will this vaccine be like the flu vaccine, where you'd have to keep on developing new ones and taking it every year?
So this is what we really don't know. We don't understand a lot about immunity to this virus. For flu, the reason that you have to give a new vaccine every year is, one, that antibodies wane, but also the virus mutates frequently. And so immunity to last year's virus might not protect you against this one. So this coronavirus mutates much more slowly than flu. It's much more stable. The real question is whether the body makes a robust enough immune response that will last long enough to protect against another one. So, the common cold is a coronavirus. You get the common cold over and over. Would a vaccine be able to make a long-lasting immune response that would definitively turn off the risk of infection, is the question.
Yep. So provided a vaccine is found, what are some of the resources and challenges behind actually making it? Who can make it?
So it depends what the vaccine platform is. And many of the vaccines that are currently being assessed are relatively new technologies where we haven't actually had licensed vaccines of that kind in use. So the whole processes around, there's early animal phase testing and then human phase 1 trials, and then you need to prove that there's adequate antibody responses, whether or not these would go into randomized controlled trials to show efficacy, given the urgency, that would be of interest. I mean, we've seen the recent Ebola vaccine trials where placebo-controlled trials were given. And then the safety of these vaccines is a concern. So for SARS and MERS in animal models, at any rate, there was concern that vaccines might actually increase the severity of disease on subsequent exposure. So ensuring safety will be absolutely critical, because it would be a disaster to give a widespread vaccine and make the situation worse. So all of these things are substantive concerns, particularly for vaccines. You have the absolute acid test of safety because you're giving them to healthy people. In the face of a risk as severe as this, individuals will have a slightly different risk-benefit appraisal, but you absolutely have to be sure that you're not going to make things worse. And then obviously there's the manufacture across multiple sites, there's technology transfer, then you've got to fill and finish, you've got to ship things around the world in a world that's much more disconnected than it ever was before, and then actually administer the thing. So it's quite an exercise.
So there's a lot of different challenges to bypass.
Lots of steps, yes.
So what would be the best way to distribute the vaccine from like a ethical perspective?
So there have been different approaches to this over time. So for influenza vaccines, in the pandemic influenza framework, one of the motivations for countries to share their virus strains for development of a library of candidate vaccine viruses is the WHO, for example, commits that any vaccine manufacturer must donate the first, I think it's 10 or 15% of their vaccine to WHO for distribution to low and middle income countries that can't afford to purchase the vaccine. So those sorts of things have been put in place for flu vaccines as prior agreements. Obviously, there will be many discussions about similar kind of frameworks for distribution of pandemic vaccines if we get them. I think one of the interesting challenges will be, it's unlikely, I think, that any single product would be able to be made in sufficient quantities for all the people who might want it. If we have multiple products, what will their use be and who will get those and how will that be decided? I think there'll be a lot of very complex questions.
Yep, absolutely. On a more local scale, would it be best to distribute the virus to, let's say, patients who are more at risk first?
The vaccine?
Yes, the vaccine.
So there are different ways of thinking about the ethical priorities of vaccination. So we actually did some work that's yet to be published, but for Commonwealth Government, thinking about the ethics of priority influenza vaccine allocation in a pandemic. And there are different ways of thinking about this. You need to first assign the principles of why you're using something. And in that, we had overarching objectives of maintaining public trust, of doing the most good, and of making outcomes equitable. And so under those sorts of framings, you need to then think about who the key vaccine groups are and how you would achieve those goals. So in that particular framework, we identified some groups who would always be a highest priority for vaccination. And obviously healthcare workers are a group who are highly exposed, highly needed to save other people's lives. And we have a duty to them because they are knowingly putting themselves at risk. We also, in the Australian context, strongly advocated for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a high priority for life-saving vaccines. They have multi-generational inequity arising from the effects of colonisation and chronic racism. And in that situation, providing an advantage that might lead to more equitable health outcomes was seen as a priority by community juries around Australia. So there are these sorts of principles. And then you come to, well, who are the people at risk of severe disease? And do you preferentially vaccinate them? Or are there populations that might spread the disease most effectively in the community who you could immunise and reduce everybody's risk? And for flu, that would be children. But for this disease, we don't really have that group. So I think at that point, then there are sort of serious discussions to be had around, well, who would have priority access? And I think that's a dialogue for the medical community. It's also a dialogue for ethics and for society to work out how those sorts of scarce resources might best be used and most appropriately and fairly apportioned, because fairness is another very important expectation in our community in the way we distribute these resources.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that can hinder the process of distribution, notably perhaps people who don't actually want to take the vaccine. Mm-hmm. What's your opinion on that?
So look, in any healthcare intervention, there will always be those who don't want it. I think this event has brought out many strong and rather discrepant views among the public about where this virus has come from. Is it 5G? I mean, there are lots of interesting conspiracy theories about coronavirus itself, and those will also be out there for the vaccine. So I think in any scenario, we understand that public will have views about different interventions. In a situation like this with a very severe disease, I would anticipate that vaccine acceptance generally would be fairly high as compared to a very mild disease, and often a lot of vaccine refusal and hesitancy occurs at a time when vaccine preventable diseases are becoming rare and the perceived side effects of vaccination are worse than the disease itself. So I think we're in a slightly different position here. But the important thing is communicating clearly, educating, understanding people's concerns, listening to people's concerns and respectfully addressing those, and understanding that, in a country like Australia, children who aren't immunised are largely not immunised because of systems barriers more than vaccine refusal. So it's really being sure that we understand who's missing out on vaccination and why, and being sure that, for example, if there are other cultures or groups who haven't had information communicated to them effectively or don't have access to medical care in the same way, that those groups aren't missing out because of perceived refusal, and that we're actively addressing their healthcare needs.
Yeah, and realistically, it's quite difficult to get absolute 100% vaccine
That's right.
distributed to the population. So is there like a way that we can know that enough of the population has been vaccinated?
So for any vaccine, and these words have become conflated with the strategy, we talk about the concept of herd immunity. So it's the proportion of the immunity of the population that needs to be immune to mean that if the infection is introduced, it won't be able to spread to epidemic proportions. So because every disease is a little bit different and some are more contagious than others, for measles, which is one of the most contagious diseases we know, 95% of the population needs to be vaccinated to stop it spreading. Something like flu, it's probably only 50%. And for COVID, we'd say it's probably somewhere in the order of about 70%. So we'd have to have a high level of population immunity that was sustained over time to prevent repeated waves of COVID.
Yep. And the final question, if, as you said before, it may be years before we get to a vaccine. If that never happens, what are some other options?
Yeah, so I think it's, we can look at other diseases that we've lived with. So HIV is a classic example of a disease that, I was around when AIDS was a new thing and went to the AIDS wards at Fairfield. It was absolutely terrifying. And over all these years, we still don't have an AIDS vaccine or an HIV vaccine, but we have effective therapies that mean that people can live with HIV and live healthy lives. So, I think we need to pursue all medical innovations, and really what makes COVID so destructive is the incredibly high severity of disease and its very high death rate. If effective therapies that can be found to reduce the death rate, then that would certainly reduce the public health and societal impacts of this virus. So all of these things are happening concurrently. Different medical therapies are being investigated. New innovations are being sought. and we may get there first, or we may get a vaccine first. Polio is another disease that had massive public health implications, and eventually vaccines did become available. So I think it's just going to be that ongoing search that's so important.
Cool. So that's all we have time for today. I hope everyone watching has enjoyed and learned a little bit more. Thanks again to Professor Jodie McVernon for joining us today. If you'd like to learn more, you can visit the Doherty website for more information. So thanks so much for tuning in.